Greetings! I am Herbert Erpaderp, and today I'm going to show you how I painted these 28mm scale Bren Gun Carriers. These are plastic models from Warlord games that I got in their British carrier section. This came with 15 infantry figures too, but I won't be painting those in this video because I painted them almost exactly the same way as I painted my commandos, which I have already made a video about. You can click the video on the upper left to go and see that, or find the link in the description. I feel I need to state that I'm not modelling a specific vehicle and I'm probably way off on historical colours, and I don't really care. If you're looking for super historical accuracy, you might be in the wrong place. I have looked at a couple of guides and pictures for ideas, but for the most part I'm just going with what I think looks good and is convincing to me, because it is me that these models need to satisfy. So let's get started. The first thing I do, as always, is to prime the model, which has been attached to a popsicle stick with blue tack so the model can be painted without being handled. For this I used Vallejo Black Surface Primer. Next, I base coated the entire model with Vallejo Model Color Bronze Green. This is a good example of just trying colours to see if I like them. This was a bit darker and more grey than I was expecting, and I didn't really like it. I still applied a highlight of bronze green mixed with buff, about a 50-50 mix, and I left it for a couple of days just to see if maybe I would change my mind. I didn't change my mind, so I resprayed the models with Vallejo Model Color Russian Uniform. I tried to spray this fairly heavily, but not so heavily as to completely obscure the bronze green underneath. I figured it would add a really subtle variation to the colour that could be interesting. I don't think this was especially effective, and I would certainly not suggest others do it unless you also, for whatever reason, tried bronze green as a base coat and, like me, decided you didn't like it. As you can see, these colours are really quite different. I then made a mix of roughly 3 parts Russian Uniform and 1 part buff. I sprayed this onto the model from above to try and give it a subtle highlighting on the upper surfaces. It is kind of hard to see, especially on camera, but if I place them side by side, you can see the effect on the model further away from the camera. I then decided to add further highlighting. I made another mix of Russian green and buff, but this time it was a 50-50 mix, and I dry brushed this highlight on, mostly trying to focus on the upper edges and sharp corners of the model, though I am definitely hitting most of the surfaces of the carrier. I feel this gives the model a nice kind of dusty, faded after being in the sun for ages kind of look. Here's another side-by-side comparison to show the difference this dry brushing has made. Next, I decided these carriers need to be a little bit darker, so I applied a wash of Secret Weapons sewer water, which just sounds lovely, doesn't it? I thinned this roughly 5 parts thinner to 1 part sewer water. I apply this fairly lightly all over the model using a fairly wide, cheap beaten up brush. The wash is fluid enough that it shouldn't get brush strokes from using a crappy brush. As you can see, this gives the model a more yellowy green tint, though the wash is still wet at this point. I feel it adds another level of dirtiness to the model. I then applied another dry brushing of roughly 50-50 Russian Uniform and buff. I tried to go a bit lighter with this, focusing mostly on the edges, but I did still kind of go a bit heavy. That's okay, I think it works and makes even more variation in the colour of the model. In hindsight, I probably should have applied the sewer water wash before doing any of the dry brushing, but I feel like this has worked pretty well anyway. Next, I apply an edge highlight using Model Color Stone Grey. As the name implies, I apply this highlight along all the sharp edges and raised bits of detail. The reason I chose to use Stone Grey is because it's fairly close to the mix of Uniform Green and Buff, but a little bit lighter, so it's different, but not so different that it looks out of place. I do this with a fine brush, in this case the Insane Detail brush from the Army Painter. I take my time and apply this carefully to avoid making mistakes. I didn't bother applying this around the top edges of the carrier because that area is going to receive a lot of chipping anyway, so it seemed a little bit redundant to do a highlight there. You can see the result does stand out a fair bit, and that's what I was going for. It will blend in a bit more later after chipping and various washes and weathering are applied. Now the basic colour of the carriers is applied, it's time to put some decals on. In preparation for this, I brushed on a coat of Minotaur gloss coat to the areas where the decals will be applied. I then selected my decals. I used the star, bridging weight number, arm of service marking, and vehicle number from the decal set that came with the British carrier section box set. For the divisional badge, I used decals from a standalone Warlord British Guards Armoured Division set that I've had for a while. As I normally do, I used Humbrol Decal Fix to apply these decals, and they went on very easily. I really enjoy it when decals just work as they should. I did almost have trouble with one of the stars on the side. The very tip folded over on itself a tiny bit, but I was able to fix it. Also, the small numbers on the sides were a little bit tricky to move around. There are a few different number sets on these decal sheets, so you can retry if you do mess them up. Fortunately, I didn't have to do that. As with most decal applications, you just have to be careful and take your time. Use a brush to manipulate the decals. If they become hard to move, use the tip of a sharp knife very carefully to drag them around. The markings I have chosen aren't based on any specific carriers, though I did reference a couple of pictures to figure out their placement, and Fog of War's video understanding British vehicle markings and decals was also quite helpful. If you want to see that video, I'll put a link in the description. In the end though, even if my decals aren't historically accurate, they look convincing enough to me, which is what matters. I leave the decals to set overnight, and then seal them in with some Minotaur satin varnish. And then it's time to dirty them up a little bit, because they're way too fresh and new looking at the moment. First, in an attempt to kill some of the brightness of the white, I apply some Secret Weapon concrete wash. This was mixed 1 part concrete wash to 2 parts Vallejo airbrush thinner, though you could use water too. I had just decided to see if using the thinner instead of water with my washes would make much of a difference. I use a fine brush to apply this very lightly to the decal, and I try to avoid getting it on the green areas if I can. I'm not entirely sure how effective this layer is, but it does seem to add a tiny bit of imperfection and variation to the colour of the markings, which is what I want. I then repeat the same process using Army Painter Strong Tone thinned 1 part Strong Tone to 2 parts thinner. Again, water could be used instead. With this, I'm not all that worried about getting the wash on the green areas. I try not to go too heavily with this. There will be much more weathering later, so it's not like this is the last chance to alter the way the decals look. I do want to blend them in with the rest of the vehicle as much as I can though. When applying this, I try to brush it on in downward strokes. That way, if there are any visible streaks, it might just look like rain marks. To blend the decals in further, I add some chipping. I use Russian uniform and again with a fine brush gently add some little chips and scratches to the decals. The idea here is to represent the paint of the markings being scratched off, but not so hard that the green paint underneath would also be scratched off. The decals have ended up looking fairly beaten up, maybe a little bit too much, but I do like the effect. To continue with the chipping, I mix Vallejo Model Color Black Grey with Model Color Mahogany Brown. I lost track of the actual ratio for this mix, but it's something like 2 parts black grey to 1 part mahogany brown. I play with it until I'm happy that it looks like a kind of tarnished dark steel colour. I apply it with a piece of foam from some model packaging and I use that to just dab it on in an up and down motion only. If you drag this along the surface of the model, it'll just look like a messy streak of paint and not at all like chipping. So up and down motions only is the way to do this. It was my intention to focus this mostly around the top of the carrier where men would be jumping in and out of the vehicle. It makes sense to me that the paint here would get quite worn. I think I might have gone a little bit overboard with it. I got excited, and I figure these are hard-working little vehicles with men climbing in and out all the time, so maybe it's not such a bad thing. Side by side, you can see this step makes a significant difference. To finish off the scratches, I take the same mixture of black grey and mahogany and using a fine brush I applied some small scratches and chips into areas I couldn't easily reach with the sponge. This is also how you would add long, thin scratches if that's what you wanted. Next, it's time to base coat the rest of the things. I do this after applying the chipping because it's obviously hard to avoid getting the chipping colour on everything. I start with the tracks. I use model colour black grey for these. I paint the entirety of the tracks. Don't forget the underside of the upper tracks. I also paint the tyres on the road wheels with the same colour, being careful to try not to paint the metal rim parts. This is pretty easy, though a little bit time consuming. Don't forget the spare wheel if you included them on your carriers, and also the metal components of the tools on the rear. I then dry brush the tracks with model colour London Grey. I mostly focus this on the edge of the tracks and the raised parts of the treads. I also use a smaller brush and dry brush the same colour onto the edges of the road wheel tyres. Then, because despite my attempts at being neat, I still got the greys onto the wheel rims, I fix those using model colour Stone Grey and a fine brush. This is pretty easy to get on the rims neatly because they're raised. You can use the side of the brush and just run it across the raised area to avoid the surrounding areas. The result is a little stark, but washes and weathering will take care of that. The intention of this next wash is mostly just to darken down the tracks a little bit. This is a roughly 50-50 mix of army painted dark tone and thinner. I just apply this fairly heavily to all areas of the tracks. I also add it to the wheels, focusing mostly on the tyres, but it also makes the green parts look dirty and used, so don't worry about getting it on those parts too. I also apply it to the springs, and because I'm a numpty, you can see at this point that I've forgotten to apply grey to the return rollers there. Of course, don't forget to apply this wash to the spare road wheels and metal tool parts, though I didn't video myself applying it to the tools for some reason. Next, I base coated the tarps on the rear of the carriers, or at least I assumed they're tarps. Whatever these rolled up things on the back of the models are, I painted them with model colour US Field Drab. I'm not really sure what colour these should be, or what they are, but I thought they would look good in this colour, so that's what I went with. I am of course careful to try and avoid getting this colour anywhere but the tarp. Fixing mistakes on the green surfaces at this point would be a bit annoying. Because of how much I thinned this colour, I had to do a couple of coats of it to get as solid a coating as I wanted, but that's not surprising. Then I apply a wash of strong tone, mixed roughly 50-50 with thinner. I apply this fairly heavily to the brown areas of the roll, trying to get the wash to build up quite a bit in the recesses and around the straps. Once that was dry, I applied the US Field Drab again, this time using a dry brush. I try not to go too heavily with this and obviously still try to avoid getting the field drab onto the body of the carrier. I make sure to hit the edges of the roll, both on the upper side and underneath. I think it looks a lot better already. Next, I apply another dry brushing, this time with Vallejo Model Colour Iraqi Sand. This time I'm using a smaller dry brush and trying to focus on the ridges and along the edges of the roll. I applied this colour just to see if I might like how it looks. Turns out I did. It is a little bit bright at the moment, but there will be more washes down the road that will take care of that. The next sensible step would be to paint the straps holding the roll in place. I did this with AK Interactive Red Brown Leather, just because I enjoy this colour quite a bit. Obviously I do this quite carefully so as to avoid accidentally painting the roll with the leather colour. The trick with this kind of thing is to just take your time. Now the buckle needs some attention. I've chosen to paint this in a metallic colour, specifically Vallejo Game Air Bright Bronze. I carefully paint the buckles with a fine brush. I do try to be as neat as I possibly can with this. Metallic colours are a bit of a pain to fix mistakes with, though a dark wash later will help cover some minor errors. Continuing with metallics, I'm going to paint the Bren guns with Italeri flat gunmetal. I'm going to paint these a bit like I painted the guns in my recent Flames of War infantry painting video. Since the Bren gun is almost entirely metal, this is pretty easy, though I am careful to avoid painting its pole. It is a little bit harder to paint the gun in the front of the carrier, but not too difficult if you're careful. It will be hard to see, so it doesn't have to be perfect anyway. These are obviously quite shiny, but that's okay. After this colour had dried, I darken it down with a wash of Secret Weapon Heavy Body Black Wash, diluted roughly 50-50 with Vallejo Airbrush Thinner. Simply brush it fairly roughly onto all the metal parts of the guns. You might need to do a second coat of this. The idea here is to have the gun look black at a distance, but with a slightly metallic look to it in certain lights and up close, with a subtle metallic highlight on the raised parts and edges. I then applied undiluted strong tone to the tarp straps. I focus most of this along the edges of the straps and in the buckles. It looks maybe a little bit too dark. To try and even that out, I thin down some strong tone, 1 part strong tone to 2 parts thinner, and apply it to the roll to try and darken that down so it looks a bit more consistent with the straps. Make sure to get this into the gaps on the ends of the rolls, of course. Then, I highlight the straps using AK Interactive Red Leather again. This is so thin right out of the bottle that it works really well for doing this kind of thing. The idea is to bring back some of the original colour without obliterating the darker washed colour beneath it. Next, I paint the wooden stock of the Bren guns with Vallejo Model Air Mahogany. Apply this carefully so as not to get any brown on the areas that should remain green. Don't forget to paint the handles too. And of course remember to paint both sides of the gun. Nobody wants a half-painted gun. Next, I painted the tool handles on the rear of the vehicle. I used model colour beige brown for this. I'm not entirely sure if these are even meant to be wooden handles, but, well, now they're wooden handles. What are you going to do about it? Then, to add a little variation to these handles, I apply some Army Painter Strong Tone straight from the bottle. I apply it lightly with a fine brush. Next, I decided I might try to fancy up the stocks of the Bren guns. I did this with Model Air Mud Brown. I used a fine brush and streaked a couple of lines here in an attempt to represent a wood grain. This was kind of hard to do in front of the camera. Also, I didn't bother applying it to the gun in the front of the vehicle. It won't be visible enough anyway to be worth the hassle. Then, because I want the wood grain effect to be quite subtle, I apply a wash of undiluted army painted dark tone to the wood parts, just to make it nice and dark. In all the pictures I see of this gun, the stocks always seem to look really dark. I did 2 layers of this for optimal darkness. After this, I applied a coat of satin varnish to protect the painting I've done so far. For this, I used NATO. This is the first model on which I've used any of their products, and they seem to work quite well so far. I leave that to dry overnight, and then I apply AK Interactive Enamel Track Wash. I brush this fairly heavily onto the tracks. It will pool into the recesses and look like dark rust and dirt. Apply it all over the track on both sides, of course being careful to avoid getting it on the wheels, suspension and hull. Though it wouldn't be hard to remove from those places anyway if you had to. I then take AK Interactive Dark Brown Enamel Wash and put it in all the gaps and crevices of the vehicle. I also slop some onto areas that might look a little bit more dirty and grimy. It can be removed later if I don't like it or if it's too messy, so none of this needs to be especially neat. I put a lot of this into the engine grills to give those some depth, and around things like the machine gun pole where it makes sense for grime to accumulate. Capillary action works quite well with these enamels in the gaps, so make use of it where you can. It's also a good idea to get this in the suspension gear. Those parts are bound to get greasy and grimy in short order. I didn't record it because I'm a dunce, but I clean up the wash with a clean brush with clean white spirits on it to gently rub away the excess dark brown. This is easy, and you'll see me doing it in the following steps. You can see the difference applying this effect has made to the lower model. It looks more interesting than the other one, at least to me. I left the enamels to dry overnight and then applied another layer of Minotaur satin varnish. I then apply AK Interactive Dark Streaking Grime. This is also pretty easy to do. As the name would seem to imply, this is for making streaks, so you just kind of paint it on in a downwards motion. You could do thicker or thinner streaks than I have, it's all personal taste. Next, I take my clean brush with thinner on it and wipe away most of the colour, again in a downward motion to simulate the grime running down the model with rain. I removed most of the colour because the model is already fairly dirty looking, and it was my hope that these streaks would just add a nice subtle extra touch. I followed this with some AK Interactive Rainmarks for NATO tanks. I've never used this, but I figured I might as well give it a try. It goes on the same way as the Dark Streaking Grime, which I did leave a little heavier than I wanted it to end up because I knew I wasn't going to put a layer of varnish between these 2 layers. As with the Dark Streaking Grime, I rub the rain marks away in a downward motion with a clean brush with clean thinner on it. This will of course blend in the rain marks and further blend and wipe away the Dark Streaking Grime. I ended up removing most of both colours. You can see some of the rain marks has accumulated in the gap at the top of the hull. I just take my clean brush and get the bristles into the gap to remove that. Easy enough. I then apply some AK Interactive Enamel Light Rust Wash to the tracks. I try to do this fairly lightly, and after brushing it on, I then go over it again with the brush dipped in a little bit of thinner. These Bren Carriers are looking filthy and well used, but they're not rusting hulks, and they're probably looked after well enough. So the only place I bother with this rust is the tracks. Really, it just makes them look a little bit more dirty than rusty, I think. Then I apply yet another coat of satin varnish. When it's dry, I lightly spray the model with AK Interactive Summer Kursk Earth. I thin this roughly 1 part Kursk Earth to 2 parts thinner. I want this to represent dust, not mud, so spraying this very thin and lightly is the way to go. I focus this on the lower half and sides of the carrier. I want the darker dust colour on the lower half and some lighter dust on top. For the lighter dust, I sprayed AK Interactive Africa Dust Effects, thinned at roughly the same ratio as the previous colour. And obviously this time I focus on the upper half of the model. The good thing about using these enamels is that you can remove it from any areas you don't want it. I used a brush with clean thinner on it to remove the dust from the Bren guns themselves, though I didn't video it. Now it's about time to add the crew, or at least give them their heads. At this point they weren't completely painted, but I thought it was worth adding their heads now. It's pretty easy, I just clip off the brass rod they had been attached to for painting as close to the head as I could. Then superglue it into place. It's a good idea to test fit these first and think about where you want the head to be looking before gluing. I will leave the passengers out until after the model has been matte varnished. Again, I didn't show the painting of these figures because they've been painted almost exactly the same way as the British Commandos I painted a while ago. If you want to see that, click the video in the upper left corner or the link in the description. The only real difference these figures have is they have different helmets, which I base coated with model colour brown violet. Of course, being a numpty, I forgot to paint the steering wheel. I used Vallejo Model Air Mahogany for this, just because. This definitely would have been much easier if I'd done it before gluing the heads on. Next, I figured I would use this MIG gunmetal pigment that I've had sitting around for however many years. I put some on my finger and rub it onto the raised parts of the tracks. This of course represents where the tracks have been worn to a shine from driving around on hard surfaces. This was kind of tricky to get onto the parts just below the mudguards, but I got there eventually. I also applied a little bit of this to the edges of the passenger compartment because I figured that would get a lot of wear too. The shine there is very subtle. Also, I forgot to film that. Be careful when applying this. It's very easy to accidentally get the pigment into places you don't want it. You can also do this with a 2B pencil, which is a little bit less messy, but with that you run the risk of scratching off the paint beneath. As a little finishing touch for one of the carriers, I glued in this pile of Piat ammo and backpacks, as well as this Piat launcher. It's probably against the regulations to just dump the ammo and the launcher in there like that, but who cares? War is a crazy place, man. The main idea behind that is just to have a nice little something to add some variety to these models. I then give the Bren Carriers and their crews a coat of matte varnish. At first, I tried using the Minotaur flat coat, but it wasn't as flat as I would have liked, so instead I applied AK Interactive Ultra Matte Varnish, which works really well. Once that's done, I sit the passengers in the carriers. I haven't glued them in yet, but I will eventually. So there we have it. That's how I painted these 28mm scale Bren Gun Carriers, or Universal Carriers if you prefer that name. I'm pretty happy with them, at least the vehicles themselves. The crew figures are okay. I mean, if I didn't like them, I would strip them and start again. I just feel I don't do as good a job with figures as I do with vehicles. But that's okay. As long as I'm improving as I go, that's fine. I think I got just about the right amount of dustiness with these. They're obviously very dusty, but it's not overpowering. And I'm very glad that I thought to paint the crew figures after applying that dust. It makes sense that they probably wouldn't be weathered the same as the vehicle, especially if they've only just got in and not been riding around as the carrier gradually became dirty, if that makes sense. I think if I were to do this again, I might try to give them a little bit less chipping. I do find it hard to not go a little overboard with the chipping, and maybe a little bit less grime would be good too. I think the pigment on the tracks has worked fairly well after the matte varnish. You can see it is still there, but it's not overpowering or anything like that. I like it. In the end, I'm really happy to add these to the rest of my painted bolt-action British force. If you want to see these little vehicles in action, I plan to play at least one solo game of bolt action, which I will be making a video about, and these will be included in my British list for that game. You'll also see the infantry that came in this British carrier section box set, so if you're interested in that, then stick around, I'll get it done sometime. For those who are interested, I will include a list of the paints I used to paint these carriers in the video description. As always, I highly recommend making your own choices for colours that are aesthetically pleasing to you, but it is nice to have some suggestions as a starting point. Hopefully this video has been helpful or interesting for you. If you have any questions, comments or suggestions, feel free to leave them in the comment section below. If there's anything you saw in this video that you would like a more in-depth explanation or demonstration of, let me know and I might do a Erpaderp's quick tips video about it. Or maybe I've already done one. You could be watching this in the future. Ooh, the world of tomorrow. If you liked this video, you can let me know by clicking the thumbs up button. If you think it should be flushed down the shitter, then obviously click the thumbs down button. If you feel so inclined, I would also appreciate it if you did the other YouTubey things like subscribing and sharing. And if you really like the videos I make, please consider becoming a patron and helping to support the channel. Head over to patreon.com/HerbertErpaderp and for as little as $1 a month, you can see my videos early, watch some patron-only bonus content, and be super cool. It's a scientifically proven fact. Click the Patreon logo on screen now or the link in the video description. If Patreon isn't your thing, that's okay. I hope you enjoy my videos anyway. I shall return soon, so until then, happy modelling and thanks for watching. Farewell.